In this fifth talk on multiphase displacement, we continue the analysis of the fractional flow curve. In this case, the objective is to analyze some incorrect applications and misleading conclusions derived from the usual interpretation of the properties of the fractional flow curve. Basically, we will make a conceptual analysis of the correction factors that we already mentioned in the previous talk. And we will see if it is possible to transform heterogeneous, three-dimensional real media, subjected to variable balance among the different forces that push the fluids, in equivalent linear scenarios. As long as there are no equations including all the variables that control multiphase displacement in real scenarios, this transformation is considered necessary to be able to apply the concepts and properties of the fractional flow curve to real hydrocarbon reservoirs. In the previous talk, we found that the same relative permeability curve gives rise to different fractional flow curves, depending on the viscosity ratio of the fluids involved. To some extent, this characteristic is what helps many authors accept that the fractional flow curve has greater physical representativeness than the relative permeability curves, which do not explicitly include the viscosity relationship. We also looked at the properties of the fractional flow curve. Fundamentally, how to interpret this curve through its tangents, which allow defining the saturation of the saturation front, and link it with the average saturation of the system. Furthermore, we commented that an important part of the curve, the one that presents the concavity upwards, according to the frontal advance theory, does not represent punctual saturation values in a linear and homogeneous system. The curve has physical meaning only from this point of tangency, until the entire oil displacement is completed. To arrive at these results, the frontal advance theory makes a series of simplifications that include, as a fundamental part, the elimination of the contribution of capillary and gravitational forces. However, the use of the fractional flow curve as a function of the water saturation transcends the frontal advance theory itself, since, as we are going to see, fractional flow curves are drawn for much more complex scenarios, and they are analyzed using their oversimplified original properties. For this widespread use of the fractional flow curve, it is first assumed that the action of gravity and capillarity can be incorporated, taking into account only the pressure changes that they originate. In other words, to generalize the curve, its form is maintained, adding the impact of the forces that were not taken into account for the original development. The second assumption is that, for real porous media, it is possible to construct a rel-perm curve as a function of the water saturation that allows evaluating production curves by analyzing linear and homogeneous media with properties equivalent to those of the more complex situations. This second assumption implies that by obtaining a pseudo-relative permeability curve for real systems, whether they are blocks, numerical simulation cells or complete reservoirs, this pseudo-rel-perm curve allows us to construct a fractional flow curve whose properties, in turn, allow us to describe the complete behavior of multiphase flow in the real system. This equation corresponds to the generalized fractional flow curve. It can be seen that a term, that includes the capillary pressure, appears in the form of a gradient as a function of the distance between the injection point of water and the production end of the system. It also appears a gravitational term taking into account the gravity, the difference in fluids densities and the dip of the structure. We will first look into the analysis of the corrective term associated with capillary pressure. To analyze this, the first thing to observe is that the water saturation is maximum at the inlet face. We are always talking about a linear medium. And it decreases towards the outlet face in such a way that it is minimal at the production end. On the other hand, we know that the capillary pressure, in water-wet systems, increases when the water saturation decreases. Therefore, when we relate all these premises, it is concluded that the partial derivative of capillary pressure, with respect to distance, is always positive. In this way, when analyzing the complete equation, it appears, mathematically, that, as the capillary pressure of the system increases, the fractional flow of water increases. In fact, This conclusion is reached by many reservoir engineers when analyzing the generalized fractional flow curve. As an example, the phrase we are looking at is taken from Laurie Dake's first book on reservoir engineering. However, the analysis we have just done does not agree with physical reality. To begin, we know that, in the lab, the rel perm to water is lower when the samples are more water wet. In addition, during reservoir production, in tight sand reservoirs, where capillary pressures are higher than in conventional scenarios, water production is usually very low, because the water phase tends to be retained in the tight Pearl system. This situation represents a severe contradiction when compared with the analysis in the previous slide. This inconsistency between prediction and actual behavior arises when analyzing the impact of the capillary pressure gradient on the equation numerator, without taking into account its impact on the denominator. When paying attention to the denominator, we realize that rel-perm ratio appears there. In systems with high capillary pressures and strongly water-wet, the oil relative permeability increases when compared to water relative permeability, leading to a bigger additive term in the denominator, which, in turn, leads to a lower calculated value for the fractional flow of water. In summary, the complete analysis indicates that, both the numerator and the denominator increase following the increase of capillary effects in the system. Reality shows us that, in water-wet systems, the impact of the denominator always masks any increase in fractional flow suggested by the numerator expression. In a more detailed analysis, it can be shown that the term of the numerator increases in proportion to the inverse of the diameter of the capillaries. Smaller diameter implies greater capillary pressure, while the additive term of the denominator increases as a function of the inverse of the square of those same diameters. But for now, it is only necessary to show that the usual analysis of the generalized fractional flow curve is, at least, partial. And the inescapable conclusion from the full analysis is that the same set of relative permeability curves cannot be used when the balance among the forces that control the fluid's displacement change. If we only analyze the pressure changes, we reach a conclusion that contradicts reality. So, only when taking into account that these same pressure changes also change the rel-perm curves, we are able to reproduce physical reality. Schematically, we developed a similar analysis in the previous presentation where the behavior or shape of the relative permeability curves as a function of the different types of displacement was analyzed in a highly idealized porous medium composed of cylindrical capillaries. In this numerical analysis, it could be seen that, precisely, in water-wet systems, the water relative permeability is at its minimum when the displacements are dominated by capillary forces. We also observed that rel-perm curves markedly change when the balance among the forces that control the fluid's displacement change. What about the gravity correction term? In this case we are going to make a different analysis, based on an exercise presented in the second book by Laurie Dake. The exercise statement can be read in this image. It proposes a displacement of oil with water, in a scenario dominated by gravitational forces. These conditions are defined as vertical equilibrium. In this exercise, the displacement efficiency is calculated following the aforementioned two-stage approach. First, the complex system is transformed into an equivalent linear one, the rel-perm curve or pseudo-function is obtained and the fractional flow curve for different fluid mobilities is generated. Second, the analyses of multiphase displacement are done on the basis of the properties of the different fractional flow curves thus obtained. We will see that the solution obtained using this procedure presents a notable contradiction. Conceptually, when gravitational forces prevail, what we observe is that the injected water undergoes a rearrangement, quickly gaining the lower part of the structure and exchanging positions with the oil, which migrates towards the top, as a result of the density difference between the fluids. This mechanism means that, if we observe the behavior at the outlet face, we notice that the water level increases proportionally to the water saturation in the structure. When this phenomenon happens, the associated rel-perm curves present this shape. This image is telling that, the higher the water saturation, the higher the water flow rate and lower the oil flow rate. This is simply explained due to the availability of each of the phases at the production end of the system. The curve that Dake obtains, for the problem presented in his book, looks like this, which of course, is very close to the one we have just seen schematically. When continuing the analysis, applying the methodology we have just seen, this relative permeability curve is transformed into fractional flow curves, associated with a mobility ratio of 33 and 0.48. The latter, corresponding to the case of less viscous oil, gives rise to a fractional flow curve that presents the concavity upwards throughout the entire displacement. These types of curves are associated with what is known as a piston-like displacement, where water leaves only residual oil behind. This interpretation leads to the outcome indicated in this figure. However, this result presents a clear contradiction. Let's see what the contradiction is. While setting the exercise, it was assumed that the displacement occurs under gravitational domain conditions such that when injecting water, it does not directly advance from the injection end to the production end. The water, basically, quickly gains the base of the structure, and the outlet face progressively increases its water saturation as oil is produced. Then, based on that model where the displacement advances according to what this first image shows, obtaining pseudo-rel perm curves and calculating the fractional flow curve for a very low viscosity oil, leads us to conclude that the displacement actually was piston-like. In other words, during the analysis, a model is postulated and a displacement mechanism is defined, calculations are done, and it is concluded that, in one of the cases, the displacement mechanism is completely different. More strikingly, the scenario where this piston-like displacement occurs, according to the conventional interpretation of fractional flow curves, is with low viscosity oil. And, in reality, this would be the scenario where segregated flow, or the vertical equilibrium condition under gravitational effects, would be more marked. Because the less viscous the oil is, the greater density difference with water is expected, and the easier the water segregation, due to the higher mobility of fluids. In summary, we are faced with a scenario in which, unexpectedly, we have a kind of reduction to absurdity. We postulate a starting scenario that allows us to solve the exercise, and the solution totally contradicts the initial postulate. This result leads us to examine if the initial postulate is wrong or if there is an error in the analysis. As the initial postulate is valid, the problem must be, necessarily, in the analysis. At this point, it is good to remember a slide that we already presented and corresponds to a couple of Mandelbrot's sentences in his introductory book to fractal geometry. These sentences clearly express that simplified models of reality are sometimes perfectly valid first approximations, but sometimes those homogeneous and continuous, highly simplified systems do not even serve as a first approximation. This is the case when trying to model multiphase flow in complex, three-dimensional systems, reducing them to equivalent linear, homogeneous systems. We can, then, summarize and derive conclusions from these analyses. In the first place, when we analyze the corrective term associated with capillary pressures, in the fractional flow curve, the analysis showed that it is not possible to use the same relative permeability curves when the balance of forces in the system changes. It is not enough to correct the fractional flow curve only for the pressure changes caused by forces that were not taken into account when determining the properties of the fractional flow curve. It is also necessary to change the associated rel perm curves. Then, when we analyze the corrective term associated with gravity, we found that it is impossible to transform a heterogeneous three-dimensional system subject to displacements under variable balance of forces, into equivalent linear and homogeneous systems, to later apply the properties of the fractional flow curve. And this leads us to the main conclusions derived from these first 5 videos on multiphase displacement in hydrocarbon reservoirs. The first conclusion is that the relative permeability curves, which depend only on the water saturation, are not useful for modeling real systems. This is equivalent to saying that the modeling curves for oil and gas reservoirs cannot depend only on water saturation. The correct modeling can only be done by algorithms that include, at least, the balance of forces, heterogeneities, displacement geometry, and saturation history. On the other hand, the equations and concepts of the frontal advance theory do not apply to real hydrocarbon reservoirs. This statement is based on the fact that real reservoirs are complex three-dimensional and heterogeneous systems where the balance of forces change as a function of the location in the structure and as a function of time or operating conditions, and cannot be assimilated to equivalent linear and homogeneous systems, in which the equations and concepts were developed neglecting the impact of most of the characteristics of the real reservoirs. And, trying to not only show what cannot be done, in the next presentation we will see how it is possible to increase the understanding of the physics and improve the description of multiphase displacements with simpler calculations. We will see that the solution is not about finding the perfect one-dimensional equation that depends on a single variable, but rather includes all the variables that physically impact the production of fluids. We are going to see a successful model in a much more complex system than the one analyzed in 1942 by Buckley and Leverett.